I'm not going to stand up here and pretend to be an authority on all things theater. I'm going to be very honest. I was not too fond of theater, or rather too familiar with theater. As a guy, I'll explain. As a guy who grew up in rural Texas, stealing people's cigarettes and listening to Pantera in people's garage, it just wasn't on my radar until I moved here and found myself kind of encapsulated by, or rather engrossed in this world of expression and saw the power of theater firsthand. Since then, I've become quite a fan, and I'm very excited that we were able to put on this program tonight as we look at the history of one of modern theater's most auspicious landmarks of a play. And to do that, in order to kind of like really dig into the history and the impact of Angels in America, we've brought on the creators of this book, The World Only Spins Forward, which is available in the gift shop if you'd like. We're going to be welcoming to the stage here in just a second Isaac Butler and Dan Coyce, but first a little bit about them. Isaac Butler is a writer and theater director, most recently of The Trump Card, a meditation on the peculiar rise of Donald Trump with the solo performer Mike Daisey. Butler also wrote and directed Real Enemies, a collaboration with the composer Darcy James Argue and the video artist Peter Negrini, which was commissioned by the Brooklyn Academy of Music, our buddies down the street, and named one of the top 10 live events of 2015 by the New York Times. He holds an MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of Minnesota, and his writing has appeared in The Guardian, Slate, American Theater. Actually, American Theater magazine is represented on the back if you want to grab a couple copies. The Los Angeles Review of Books and other publications. He is from here in Brooklyn. Joining him is Dan Coyce, his co-author. He's an editor and writer for Slate's Culture section and a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. He's the former culture editor at Slate, where he launched the Slate Book Review. He previously co-hosted the podcast Mom and Dad Are Fighting and is a frequent guest on Slate's Culture Gabfest. His previous book was Facing Future, about the Hawaiian musician Israel. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that name. Brother Is. I know him. For Bloomsbury's 33 and a Third series. And his next book is How to Be a Family, a memoir of parenting around the world. Please welcome to the stage Isaac Butler and Dan Coyce.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're here. We're so excited to be here in Brooklyn, the very borough where Angels in America was mostly and panickedly written.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, fun fact, the Brooklyn Historical Society is like sort of in between. It is walking distance both from where Hannah and Joe Pitt live in the play and Luquier Street where the play was written.
So we want to start off, rather than just doing a talk about the book, we just want to give you a little bit of the book. So we've got a staged reading to show you of a chapter from the book with an all-star cast. So please welcome up many, many fine people. The book critic of Slate, Laura Miller, writer for TheNewYorker.com, Vincent Cunningham, Emily Nussbaum, the TV critic for The New Yorker, Mark Harris, an excellent writer for New York Magazine,
Beloved actor Daryl Lathan, playwright and writer Stephen Levinson, writer and performer Isaac Oliver, star of stage and screen Heather Lind.
All right, so we're going to share mics. Great. Join me up here. The section we're about to read is set in 1993, right here in New York City, and it covers the birth of the Broadway production of Millennium Approaches, the first part of Angels in America. Great. Don't you have the first line? I do have the first line. Yeah, all right. Is that right? Yeah, we got to step forward. Find your light, guys. David France, author of How to Survive a Plague. By 1993, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was a starker redrafting of the policy against gay people in the military, had launched a conversation about gay people that was as hostile as it had ever been.
Pat Buchanan, speech at the Republican National Convention. The agenda Clinton and Clinton would impose on America, abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat. That's change, all right. But it's not the kind of change America wants. It's not the kind of change America needs. And it's not the kind of change we can tolerate in a nation that we still call God's country.
France. In 92 was a remarkable uptick in the death rate. 93 was even worse. 94 was double that. So those years were the worst in some ways.
Frank Rich, chief theater critic, New York Times, 1980 to 1993. No one wanted to produce plays on Broadway. Theaters literally sat there dark for months, sometimes years at a time. Now producers line up to get into these Broadway theaters, but in my day, they'd give theaters away. Moose Murders played in the O'Neill, where Book of Mormon is now.
Rocco Landisman, producer on Broadway. Broadway shows are a bad investment. Producing them is a bad career. If you're not going to produce plays you believe in that won't make money, why produce at all?
David Marshall Grant, Joe on Broadway. I was a gay actor. I was living in the Hollywood Hills, trying desperately to be in the closet. You couldn't be a gay movie star at the time. You probably still can't, really. But I was just stuck with this idea that being gay was going to get in the way of every dream I had. All I wanted was to be a famous movie star with a big family. Please put a parenthetical that says I was laughing uproariously here. Sorry. My goals were ludicrous. But that was me, being gay. I thought you couldn't have a family. You weren't going to have a family being gay in 1980. I was raised to believe in goodness as a living and breathing identity. You just did the right thing. And part of that was to do a job that helped the world. You had to succeed in that job, of course. You know, a great doctor, a civil rights attorney. You had to choose a righteous path, and then you'd better be in the New York Times about it. I related so much to Joe's need to be a good man. That's all he wanted to be.
Marcia Gay Harden, Harper on Broadway. My agent, Brian Bloom, who recently died, was so eager for me to look at this play in a way that he wasn't usually. It was given to me with a kind of reverence for the material. He was one of many gay agents in New York, and it was clear that it spoke to him in a deeper way. I think if I had been as stupid as to say, no, I need to do some more films, I would have met with a lot of friction.
Jeffrey Wright, The Lees on Broadway. Just after Christmas, I got called in to audition for Angels. I'd heard about it, but only on the periphery. I knew the scope and the themes, and I knew it was this extraordinary work of theater. I read the script, it was incredibly daunting. But also it was inclusive of all the reasons that I wanted to be an actor in the first place.
George C. Wolfe, director on Broadway. We saw tons of people.
Cherry Jones, actor. I got this audition, and I was moving back to New York, and I filled this huge backpack that I had taken on a backpacking tour of Europe, and they auditioned me on a frigid, frigid day, and I came right from the train station to the Walter Kerr. Peter Frechette and Marcia Gay Harden were there. And because it was so cold, and I had walked from Penn Station, and I had this heavy backpack, my back froze up. I couldn't move. I was in agony. Marcia Gay sat there, and she wouldn't remember this, but she massaged my back while we were waiting to audition.
I want to remember that, because I like that I would do that. I probably thought that she was going to get the part and that I should help her go in and get it.
Marcia Gay went in before I did.
From the minute I walked in the door for the audition, I forgot everything. I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stop being angry. I remember needing to wipe up a puddle on the floor. I had fallen over on my knees, and I had gotten the floor wet with how angry I was, how much I was crying.
Of course, Marcia Gay got the part.
I just tried to focus on the ideas and the language. I think I went back for a callback, and George hired me. And after we were in rehearsal, he said, I saw 1,000 Negroes. I chose you.
Kathleen Chalfant, Hannah on Broadway. Marcia and Jeffrey were so clearly wonderful choices because they were both kind of centers of anarchy. They were the clearest expression of George's aesthetic and the kind of danger that George inserted into the process.
Michael Petschaft, Tony Kushner's assistant, 1991 to 93. Marcia Gay Harden was wonderful, but there was also a feeling that she was crazy. It really served the part. There were these times when you felt like you couldn't walk into her dressing room. Something's incubating in there, but I don't know if I want to touch it.
Wolf. I think so much of what I did in part one was keeping the hype out of the room and letting everybody play and discover. Because the hype was monumental. The hype was ridiculous.
Tony Kushner on The Charlie Rose Show, May 1993. I think that the reason it's gotten as much attention as it's gotten, and it's a sort of extraordinary amount of press attention, is probably more due to the fact that it's happening coincident with the transformation in American culture and politics. This spring has seen a full public flowering of the change that's occurring in the political and cultural status of gays and lesbians in the United States.
Whoa.
But you can't work from hype, and you can't create from hype. God knows you can't discover anything new. And regardless of X number of people in the cast who had done it before, we all had to discover the play together anew.
Grant, I went to New York to audition and met George, which was like meeting a tsunami. He's just beyond.
Chalfant, meeting George for the first time is a little bit like sitting down with a whirlwind for a cup of coffee.
Joe Mantello, Lewis on Broadway. You know, if you've never met George Wolfe, he's got the metabolism of a hummingbird.
They've gone through various directors, you know. They've gone through a whole process, which I really knew nothing about. And I definitely had not worked with Jeffrey. I'd not worked with Marcia. I'd not worked with Stephen or Joe, or I had no prior relationship with anyone. But I remember I just think I love talking to actors, and I like actors, and I believe you could ask them. I believed I gained their trust fairly early on.
Mantello. He talks fast. There's a lot coming at you. If you receive it, if you open yourself up to it, it's completely fucking inspiring.
Right. I've worked with many great directors, but George is singular, particularly when it comes to carving through social dynamics, gender dynamics, sexuality, race dynamics. From a technical standpoint, his way of shaping the timeline of storytelling is unmatched. The action, the dialogue, the silence, all has a relationship to each other in a kind of symphonic way.
Hardin. He's like a bass guitar. He's like a tune that can't stop playing. He moves constantly. He speaks and moves and directs in syncopated rhythms. I clearly remember one day George says, okay, Marcia Gay, I see what you're doing. I want you to come to the door more of ba-da-da-bum-bow. And I said, I think I need to come to the door more like bow-bow. And he was like, okay, try that.
Wolf. In some respects, part one was Tony and I figuring out how to work together and sparring at times. You know, he, by that time, knew incredibly well the way to do it. But that's the antithesis of figuring out how to do it.
George is a dramaturg in the sense of going through the script line by line, talking about serious structural things. We would just have these conversations here and there. We'd have dinner, I'd go to his place after a day's rehearsal.
I mean, to be really honest with you, there are two schools of directing. You stand where you are and demand actors come to you, or you go to where they are and you charm, seduce, empower them to go on the journey in that direction that you think is correct.
Ron Liebman, Roy Cohn on Broadway. What I did in New York was fairly consistent with what I did in Los Angeles because I had sculpted it perfectly.
Grant, Ron Liebman was just a tour de force. Ron was just crazy on the stage. God love him, but I don't think he looked at me once.
Right. Unveiling my inner Belize was a serious challenge over the course of the rehearsal process.
We were working in a very methodical way, and Jeffrey was finding his way inside the material.
It was very much a process of discovery and stripping away of self-consciousness and layers of biases. I can't say that I was always the most evolved when it came to issues of sexuality and sexual identity. I can't say that in the locker room of my high school football team that we were the most evolved around such matters. I remember at one point George saying, Jeffrey, drag queens don't drag their feet.
I think everybody, all the producers involved, and I'd say Tony as well, were very panicked. I think because he wasn't quite delivering on, for lack of a better word, the comedy. Do you know what I mean? It's unfair for me to reduce it to that, but I think a lot of it was that.
There was no small degree of frustration with me from the powers that be.
I remember having a very difficult conversation, calling him up and saying, Jeffrey, today, bring it today. Which I'd never done to another actor, but there was really a tremendous amount of panic about whether he could deliver.
Pet shaft. There was always this kind of, I never thought anyone was going to be fired, but there was at times a tension in the air about doing a play like this. There's so much riding on it.
Grant, Joe and Jeffrey did not get along particularly, but that can happen.
There was a lot of tension, just personality stuff between Joe and Jeffrey off stage, but they worked brilliantly together on stage, and I just love that.
Ellen McLaughlin, the angel on Broadway. Tech went badly on Broadway. There was the flying, which in and of itself would have eaten up tech, but that wasn't the only problem. People were getting hurt. Everyone was working insane overtime, doing quick fixes, and making it up as they went along because there was no time to figure everything out. The crew were just fried, and the actors were scared and confused.
Grant, the tech for Millennium approaches, oh my God, it just went on forever. By the time previews began, you felt like you were on stage for 20 years, which made opening night a little easier.
Chalfant, tech was disastrous. It was terrible. There were all kinds of big set pieces. There were these giant icebergs that had been made but really didn't work. They looked like big pieces of white plastic, no matter how much smoke you put around them. We spent a long time trying to integrate them into the production because someone had spent a lot of money making them. Eventually, they were abandoned backstage.
Robin Wagner, set designer on Broadway. Each theater on Broadway has its own problems, but the Walter Kerr is just small. It's hard to work in the smallest theater on Broadway.
McLaughlin. Furniture and scenery had to be stored and flown on these suspended pallets because there was no space in the wings to put anything. Things kept falling or shifting in the air, and we were all having to work at such a maniacal speed that it was just a matter of when the next mistake would be made or accident happened.
Mary Klinger, stage manager on Broadway. We canceled previews because we weren't ready.
McLaughlin. The stakes just kept getting higher and higher.
Mantello. I remember the night of the first preview. We had been in tech for a very long time. There was deafening buzz. The show had been delayed. It was scary.
I always say, when we are in previews, we are not the audience's victim. They are ours. We're learning, and they are on the journey with us. You can't let fear of judgment stop your journey.
Mantello. George understood how scared we were. He said, "Oh, please, 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 tonight is nothing. We're allowing the peasants into the castle to see what we've been up to." And we were like, yeah, we're allowing the peasants into the castle to see what we've been up to. Wagner. The first preview, our stage manager, was in the balcony.
Klinger. Up in the gods at the Walter Kerr, they built me a booth, which is gone now. The Mary Klinger Memorial Booth.
Wagner. When it came time for the angel, the ceiling didn't open, her radio system was out of whack, and I heard this voice call from the balcony to the backstage people.
Open the ceiling so the angel can come through.
Bring in the damn angel.
Open the fucking ceiling!
I felt at times very overwhelmed. I wouldn't say panicked. I felt very overwhelmed.
Susan Cheever, John Cheever's daughter, who's a writer, interviewed me for something in my little apartment in Brooklyn. I just won the Pulitzer, and Millennium was about to open. And she came up to my apartment, and we talked. She asked if I was going to move because it was a pretty miserable-looking place. And I said, I don't know, I have to see what happens. She said, what do you mean? And I was like, what if it fails? Then I'll just be back to writing little plays for little tiny theaters downtown.
We went out for drinks after some crazy long night.
She looked at me and said, you really have no idea what's happened.
Everybody was so excited.
You're really never going to, even if you do fail, you'll never be one of those people again.
We're trembling with
You've
excitement.
gone over to the other side now.
And George was saying, miracles are happening.
You'll always have done this thing, and it's permanent.
Miracles are happening.
Arden. I had a wig.
Oh, God, the wig.
I perceived Harper's innocence and her Mormonness through her hair, so I had a wig, a beautiful red wig that made me feel like her. It was thick, brownish red, it fell down past my shoulders, it felt biblical and pure. And George, during previews, he should tell you why, he told me, you need to take the wig off. We need to see you.
Well, she had on this very sort of like, I'm a woman of the plains brownish wig. I knew it had to go, and then Tony was going, it has to go, it has to go, it has to go.
I just felt, no, she's not me. I'm ugly, she's not. I'm not taking the wig off. And the next night, George said again, you have to take the wig off.
And then at one point, it's like, Marcia, I'm taking the wig, and she's going, no.
Opening night, we had a tug of war with the wig.
Like, we're literally wrestling with the wig. And I'm trying to get it out of her hands, and I said, you're beautiful, you don't need this. And I think she smeared her makeup, it was just, oh no, I want my wig.
I was furious with myself, but I'm sure it looked like I was angry at George, I want my fucking wig. and places. And George is going, trust me, and I was weeping in the dressing room saying, I don't know if I can trust you, I want my wig.
I mean, it was just really drama. It was really just crazy.
George didn't want to hide behind any tricks. I didn't realize the wig was a trick, but when I took it off, it was like taking a veil off. The audience couldn't be distracted by anything.
I think she was breaking up with some boy at the time. Yeah, I love them all so dearly.
That night, my agent came backstage and he hugged me so hard, he popped the strap on my bra. And years later, when he passed away, I understood what the play meant to him.
Margot Lyon, producer on Broadway. I remember Tony wore pearls, and he went to a Chinese restaurant on opening night instead of going to the show. That was his opening night ritual.
Hardin, after we were all getting dressed to walk to the after party, and the streets of New York were like a Hopper painting. The street lights were putting up perfect little triangles of light. And when we left, there were hordes of people because they were waiting for us. And everyone was wearing long gowns and monkey suits because they had just come from the play. We passed this one Korean fruit stand, and someone had taken one of those plastic milk crates and was standing on it, and they were in that triangle of light, and they were reading the review that had just come out. They were surrounded by a semicircle of the audience and passerby on the street, and they were reading this paper loudly to this crowd of people. And every time they would read a good sentence, the crowd would cheer.
Mantello. For a lot of us, that production was like going from 0 to 100 in our careers, going from being unknown to the play everyone was coming to see.
Stephen Spinella, Pryor on Broadway. It got kind of creepy. People would come up backstage basically asking me, are you dying of AIDS? It was awful. The New York Times asked me if I was HIV positive or not. I didn't want to set up this situation where there's a divide between those communities. But if I didn't answer the question, people would assume I was positive. Honestly, looking back, I think I did it with a little bit of cowardice.
The New York Times, June 5th, 1993. When Stephen Spinella takes his clothes off on stage, the murmurs in the audience are frequently audible. He's so skinny. The lesions, are they real?
Spinella, it was kind of a strange time.
Liebman, I didn't like to know who was coming. I made that request. So I used to stand next to Joe Mantello, and he would tell me at curtain call as we were bowing. He'd say, 4th row, she looks a little chubby. It's Madonna. That was my favorite part.
Pat Shaft. I was looking back at the notebooks I was keeping when I worked for Tony. The first couple of notebooks are do this, do that, get a copy of this book. Then, after Millennium, it's like Matthew Modine and his phone number, Robert Altman and his phone number.
Hardin, I'd walk through the West Village and people would come up to me and say, I took my parents to see the play, and then I told them I was gay. Or, I took my parents to see it, and then I told them I was dying. And we would cry on the street. That happened once every couple of weeks.
Grant. Joe said to me one day, we were exhausted, eating in between shows, we were just quiet, and he said, you know, you are experiencing this, right? Every moment? And I said, every moment. And he said, good, because we'll never experience something like this again. We all knew that.
Mantello. I remember we opened and shortly thereafter award season started. All of a sudden being in the mix for awards, that changed the group dynamic.
Grant. There was a term, Joe coined it, Tony fever. Everyone got it. Who was going to get what nomination? Jeffrey or Joe or both? Was Marcia going to win? Was Kathleen going to get nominated?
Ron Liebman, accepting his Tony for Best Actor. Jessica, the love of my life. Maybe we can get an apartment with a washer-dryer now.
Liebman, that was a joke between me and my wife, Jessica Walter. The next day, my agent didn't get any calls for work. He got calls from washing machine companies. Would Mr. Liebman do a spot for us? And we'll give him the washing machine.
Stephen Spinella accepting his Tony for Best Featured Actor. First of all, I have to thank Joe Mantello, the magnificent Joe Mantello, who is a great actor and a great good friend.
Spinella. Joe and I went through so much shit. We were on Broadway for the first time and were immediately thrust against each other for the Tony Award. We talked about it, and he was so great. He was the one who initiated that conversation. He was the one who made sure that we always stayed on an even keel.
Mantello. This sort of thing can be so destructive to a company. People's contributions get untangled and singled out as more valuable, more worthy of acknowledgement.
Spinella. When Joe was angry about something, we would talk about it. And Joe saved me. Joe got me through so much. He was just, thank God for Joe Mantello.
Mantello. Then you go back into rehearsal.
To be continued. So Laura Miller is going to stay up, and can you please welcome to the stage two of the wonderful people you just met, Kathleen Chalfant and Ellen McLaughlin for the original Broadway production.
What's that?
All right. Dan, I miss you.
Hello?
It's such. This is working? Yeah.
Yeah.
To be on stage with Ellen and Kathleen, also Dan and Isaac, but especially Ellen and Kathleen, and also to play Ellen on the stage in this very limited engagement. I did see the 1991 production in San Francisco back in the day. And it was an experience I'll never forget. I think I was an arts writer at the time, and my friends were all critics, and I'm a critic, and so someone would say, "Oh, do you want to come to this thing with me tonight?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, sure. What the hell?" So I was always going to decommissioned housing projects to see people do interpretive dance in the different rooms and people blowing up robots and stuff. So I knew nothing, and I came with my friend who was a theater critic, and I can remember walking out and having that feeling that you have very, very rarely when you have an encounter with a work of art, where you just have a feeling of complete stillness, like the surface, the perfectly smooth surface of a beautiful lake. You don't want the wind or anything you say to disturb that perfection that you feel right after you've had an experience like that. So it's great to see both of you again after all this time.
It's interesting that you would talk about that.
You want to use mine?
I am an actor. I should be. That was a production of a very small space. It was 200.
Well, I don't, yeah.
It was a little warehouse space in California. It no longer exists, called the Eureka Theater, where we did the first production of both. Sort of, kind of.
Kind of.
Because we didn't have time to actually rehearse Perestroika, or it was the first night we hadn't actually done the show ever.
We had to do, it was part of the contract that we had to do both parts of the play, and Perestroika had just was in the process of being written, and so what we decided, everybody decided, what we would do was a staged reading that often took 5 hours. And it wasn't the whole thing. We had narrative bridges. We left parts out so that people, and we discovered that if we started at 7, people would stay when they understood that there were 3 acts. Well, 5. 5 in those days.
And an epilogue.
But if we started at 8, and we said act 4 at 11 or so, people groaned and left. It was more than they could bear. But the people who did the 7 to 11 version seemed to like it a lot. And the narrative, and sometimes we would leave parts out and then put parts back in. During the time that we were doing it, Thurgood Marshall died. And there's a wonderful scene, which I think is not in the play anymore, a discussion between Lewis and Joe about Thurgood Marshall. So we just put that back in because we thought you should.
Our attempt with the stage reading this evening was to pay homage to those Eureka stage readings in 1991 with a little bit of...
Millennium was fully staged, but
yeah, those Perestroika stage readings, controlled chaos on stage. We were trying to recreate a little of that magic.
Well, we were 2 weeks into rehearsal before we got the script. And when we did get the script, it was
long. It was longer.
We started reading the first the script at 10 o'clock in the morning. We took a lunch break, and we weren't done after a 6-hour rehearsal day.
And then the other thing was that they hadn't somehow or another thought about rehearsal space for Perestroika. So we rehearsed in lobbies all around the Bay Area, moving from place to place, whatever was available. We would show up and talk for a long time.
Dan and I are learning new things about the history of ancient America. Wait. So you rehearsed.
You have to have agenda.
I know. We're gonna have to have an appendix
Errata.
of things we didn't know. So wait. So you rehearsed in lobbies throughout.
We did.
the great city of San Francisco.
Empty rooms, and sometimes in Oakland too. I think it was a Bay Area. People took us in.
Yeah. Well, I think it was partly because we were supposed to have been starting rehearsal 2 weeks previous.
Oh, right.
And so by the time, we should have been in tech when we were basically first touching on some of the scenes.
Right, and writing the narrative bridges.
But the narrative bridges is so crazy because you'd come out as a character in costume and say, for instance, Act 5, I came out as the angel with the wings and everything. Act 5, Heaven, I'm in Heaven, which is the name of the act. And it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. And this woman in the front row said, Act 5? What are you talking about? Act
But she
5?
stayed.
And I was standing, and she said, do you know what time it is? And I said, I'm not wearing a watch. And she said, well, how long is this? And I said, well, we've never done it, so 45 minutes? And she said, oh my God! She said, the buses have stopped running. How are we going to get home? It was like, this is a weeknight. Some of us have to work. And she said, but that's it. There isn't an Act 6, right? And I said, well, there's an epilogue. And she said, oh my God!
So after
How long is that? And I said, well, I don't know. Again, we haven't done it. So I think maybe 15 minutes. And she said, oh, okay, that's it. That's it. We'll stay. And she turns around and she goes, we're staying, right? And everybody's like, eh. And she said, but you have to tell him, cut. This is ridiculous.
And he was gone by then. Gone. They left it to us. And then we solved that problem by starting an hour earlier. And then it was okay.
But he came up afterwards. We were walking across the backstage and, trudging across sort of glassy-eyed at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And he said, there's something really, Tony, he said, there's something really amazing about what happens when people have been in the theater for that long. They become very malleable and sort of, they forget where they work and who they are and what their addresses are. And we're like, yeah, cut, please.
Fortunately, the one that I went to, it's not working.
It's on.
It is,
okay.
It
is working.
It is, okay. I went to a matinee, so that was the way to go. So one thing this book really gives the impression of is just that this play was like this incredible contraption stuck together with like rubber bands and bubble gum, and it's like churning along at this incredible speed, and pieces of paper like this flying out of it all the time. And this really, for me, fits with the way that it felt so immediate in the moment, For all of us who lived in San Francisco, this was what we were living through with our friends, and but coming back to it now, so many of the conditions that prevailed then have changed, and even the name of the second play, Perestroika, has this sort of shadow of the Cold War over it, which now people just seem to barely remember.
On the other hand, it was because the speech that opens Perestroika is my favorite character maybe that I ever played in my life, named Alexei Antediluvianovich Prilapsarionov, the world's oldest living Bolshevik. And he gives a speech that begins, theory, how are we to proceed without theory? And it was meant to be a critique of the way the Soviet system had ossified. But what it became, or has become, or what we've seen, is that it almost perfectly described what happened. And the description of what the future will be without theory in Alexei's mouth is what the former Soviet Union is now, what the kleptocracies that have grown all through what was the former Soviet Union. So it was...
And elsewhere.
And elsewhere, yes. Well, it's spreading kleptocracy as we go. So that it's extraordinary that there is a kind of the prescience of art that you say things you don't know you're going to say that.
Yeah. And it became this play that was, one of the producers, I think, in the book says, I wasn't getting, I wasn't hearing from a lot of theaters because it was supposed to be really long and it was about AIDS, and then this review came out and all of a sudden the phone was ringing off the hook. But it became such a sort of, American icon in a way, even though it started out being, did Tony Kushner originally explain it? It had like
it was a 90-minute chamber musical for 4 gay men and an angel.
Yeah.
There was no angel. It was just more. It was going to be about Mormons, Roy Cohn, and there's the judicial process. I can't remember. Mark probably knows this, but it was very modest.
Yeah.
And it was all going to be guys, and then he realized that more than half of the Eureka Theater Company was women actors, and he had to do something about that. But
that's a great example of how, the collaboration of the condition of theater shapes the creation of the work, and in a way that kind of forces the work into a sort of broader scope.
Right, it's impossible to think of Angels in America without Harper, for example, without the character of Harper. But that character exists only because an actress named Laurie Holt was part of the Eureka Theater and Tony had to write a part for her.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we discovered when we were writing the book that I think was sort of, we rediscovered every week as we kept reporting it is, there's a lot of different contingencies that had to there is the sort of moonshot quality of even this play existing, right? They could have not gotten the grant from the NEA that funded, Tony Kushner writing it. He could have not gotten the loan from a friend that he needed to have enough money to keep writing it. Oscar Eustace,
John Grant's cousin or something, right?
Yeah. Oscar Eustace only came to see, who eventually commissioned the play and has, been one of Tony Kushner's best friends for decades, only came to see Bright Room Called Day in New York City because he had missed the curtain for the show he was supposed to see that night. And then a friend was like, hey, come see the show. So, there is a weird way with this play. I mean, if you do theater, all plays feel in some way that contingent. But in the history of this play, the number of things that shaped it, both positive and negative events that shaped it, that go into creating it, was really shocking, I think, and really fascinating for the two of us to learn about as it went along.
And it suffered from the difficulty that's throughout the American theater, which is that had Frank Rich not seen the play in London, it wouldn't have come to New York.
Right. And Frank Rich had seen a Bright Room Called Day, an earlier Tony Kushner play, and panned it. Panned it so much. There's a whole section in the book where Kushner is talking about. Part of me, I was thinking I would give a speech before the show and talk about how Frank Rich was there to destroy me. He could have decided. I've seen one play by that playwright. I don't forget it. He could have easily.
He did decide that
Well,
because we were doing the play for years and years and years. Tony was winning prizes and prizes and prizes, and people were sending stacks and stacks of cash, and he wouldn't come.
Right.
Well, also, I was in the Bright Room Called Day, the public that got, it's one of the worst reviews I've ever seen. And I was sitting, it was during the era 90? No. 80s. Anyway, it was during that era when you get your opening night reviews in an actual paper on the night of opening night at the party, and we all thought it was pretty good. But I was sitting with Tony between me and Joseph Papp. It was one of his last productions, and the papers came in, and Tony's reading it between us, and I'm looking at it thinking, oh, this was one of those reviews that if it had come to, for instance, anybody else, you'd stop playwriting. That's it, because you'd think, well, that's not good. It was a sort of break his fingers so he will never write again reviews. But he had just gotten the commission for Angels, and he had to write something. And he would never, ever have written anything after getting that review. And that was Frank Rich.
I think that the memorable line from that is an early front runner for the most irritating play of the year.
It was shocking. And I've read my own reviews, and they've been pretty terrible sometimes. But that was really shocking. And after we finished reading the review, Pat put his arm around Tony and he said, "I'm going to extend it a week." That's the kind of producer he was. They have, his like will not see again.
I want to ask Dan and Isaac, each one of you, what are the most surprising things you learned about this play in the process of putting this oral history together?
Great question, Isaac.
Oh boy. God, what is the most surprising thing I learned while... there's a lot of really, fun... I would say that actually, because Ellen, you're here, I think it's worth bringing up, it will surprise you, or maybe it won't, exactly how many things can go wrong when you try to put a human body in the air. We were not meant to do that. It turns out it's I don't believe in God, but it's still a defiance of God's law, apparently. And Ellen told me many. So when we did our interview, Ellen had many stories. And you think I guess they had some trouble doing it then, and then they ironed it out, and it was fine after the sort of the first American productions. And it's anyone you talk to about it's I almost died one night because the cables, every single person you spoke to who played the angel had an incredibly memorable, near-death experience doing the play. So one of the surprising things I think was every time we found something that was true from production to production, no matter what, that was always an unbelievable revelation. And the angel flying one was really an incredible one.
Right, and so now Tony has basically said, don't try to fly the angel. It's just a bad idea. It's going to eat up rehearsal time, and you don't have that rehearsal time. No one does. So unless you've got so much money, don't do it. I was really very surprised. Wait, I had a really great answer, and now it just fell out of my head as I was. Wait, say Dan to me in an expectant way.
Dan?
Well, what really surprised me while we were researching it was this whole story of the film version of Angels that never was. But if you imagine what it could have been, it's magical and horrible, which is maybe horrible, which was the version that Robert Altman almost made but did not make of Angels in America. This guy just made a hilarious face when I said that. He was like, Robert Altman. I mean, and so in some ways he seems like maybe ill-suited to the work, but he loved it. He loved Angels. Michael Petchef, Tony's assistant, had his phone number in his little notebook, and he optioned it right after it premiered on Broadway. And Fine Line was going to make it as 2 full-length feature films, like 2.5 hours each. At one point, they were going to release them like a month apart from each other to like maximize their Oscar chances or whatever.
Starring Robert Downey Jr. as Lewis,
right?
And
Tim Robbins as Joe,
Steven Spinella as Pryor,
right?
And
Pacino still as Roy Cohn.
Because I mean,
yeah.
come on.
Yeah. But like a 10 years younger Roy Cohn than he would eventually end up playing. But so this went through. Tony wrote a whole screenplay that he now professes not to remember a single thing about, but which we read because Isaac found it in the archives of the University of Michigan where it had been hidden away. And it's like Tony's best attempt to write a Robert Altman movie. It's got all these like scenes of like characters crossing paths unexpectedly and coincidences and a great special effects moment that I'm sure Altman would have completely fucked up of Pryor going up to heaven. And
do you want to describe Pryor's ascent to heaven? Because I actually think that's really like the.
It's so he starts on. He's in the hospital and then he rises up and you see like a cutaway of the hospital floor and then he gets to the next floor and there's doctors and surgery. Then he goes to the next floor and there's doctors and surgery and one of them turns to him and his eyes are glowing white and wings unfurl from him. And then he rises up again and some other insane thing happens and then he's in heaven. I don't think Robert Altman is going to pull that off necessarily. But so this movie came delightfully or perilously close to being made before Tony realized that Robert Altman was just high all the time and was not going to do the work necessary to make this movie happen. And Altman kept saying, well, have you solved all the problems of the screenplay? And Tony was like, I've never made a movie. What are you talking about? And then it didn't happen.
Yeah, and if you ever want to research American film directors, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor has an incredible collection of their papers. And Robert Altman has, amongst other things, crates of papers of movies that he never made. The funniest one, which is the only one I can remember, is that he was going to make an Amos and Andy film that never happened.
Can you imagine?
No. I'm not going to imagine. But anyway, so like I love Robert Altman, but like going through these papers, seeing their memos about how they were going to budget it and how they forgot to budget for the smoldering pit of hell and so needed to write a budget addendum. I mean, it's like these very, like it's mostly the business correspondence, so it's very kind of mundane, but it's this extraordinary thing that never happened that I think would have been, whether it was terrible or brilliant, like an amazing chapter in film history.
Kathleen, you've said that the character whose name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce is one of your favorites ever. Yeah. I guess one of the perennial questions about Angels in America is the first part versus the second part, because the first part just feels so perfect, and the second part, there's a lot of feelings in many different directions about Perestroika. As people who have performed in it, what are your feelings and thoughts about that question?
I have a great preference for the Perestroika, not surprisingly, since I spent much more time actually on stage.
Me too.
Hanging in the air, rehearsing it.
I just think it's such a wildly ambitious and gorgeous piece of, it's such a great mess. And what it aspires to is, it's wonderful, and it inspired a lot of people. And yeah, I mean, Millennium is an incredibly substantial and solid, and it's a perfectly proportioned thing, but Perestroika is trying to do something that is just a little bit beyond the capability of even Tony, and I love it for that. But you asked Kathy, so I'll get out there. Oh, okay.
I concur. There's the sort of mad joy of it, and daring all the time. It's very exciting. It was very exciting to be in on the making of it, from the 24-hour staged readings to trying to figure out what those the gods were doing. The best part of that scene are the stage directions, which is one of the great poems in the American literature that describes what the people who are running the universe are doing while they're doing it. It's a wonderful thing, and that idea is somehow the idea that drives perestroika. So I agree, and I miss the parts that are gone.
Yeah. So many parts are gone.
Yeah, well, we pulled 3 entire plays out of the stack of pages that we had. And right. Some of them, one of them became Slavs, but there are entire plays that had to go, and I miss those plays. There was a play about the nurse character that I played, Emily, who shows up in a couple of scenes in the first, in Millennium in particular. And she's, I mean, like all of the characters that I played, they're not dimensional characters. They're people who come in and sort of identify problems or make prophecies, or they're sort of walking ideas, but they're not actual dimensional characters you need to care about. And there basically wasn't time for Emily to have an entire play. It was a good one, but she didn't.
There's a beautiful speech for Emily in the original. I've read the original Perestroika once, and then I've not been able to access it again. But there's a beautiful speech where Emily talks about her partner dying of AIDS and why she's starting this ring of nurses stealing AIDS medication.
And the AIDS nurses were the ones who started ACT UP. I mean, there was like this whole underground movement of the people who were actually doing the hard work of caring for these patients, who decided, no, this has to change. The system has to change. We have to serve these people differently. And if it takes this sort of subversive movement, that's what it's going to take. And there were meetings in coffee shops that we cut. I mean, it was a great play, and I love that character. But you can only really care about maybe 5 people, 5 characters. An audience really can't, or really 4 characters, and everybody else has to come in, do their job dramaturgically, and get off.
I have to say, there's another character of Ellen's that was cut that. It's heartbreaking, the fur baby. The fur baby was there was a lot of discussion about abortion during the course of the play, and the fur baby was Harper's child that was never born, who was in the middle of the freezing cold in Central Park.
In like a panda suit.
In a panda suit, smoking. She was great. So if anybody can look into these archives, the fur baby, there's another play.
One journey I definitely went through in writing this book was coming to a great appreciation of all that Perestroika is trying to accomplish. And it's amazing to me that Millennium Approaches Part 1 basically has not changed or been rewritten in any way since 1991, maybe 92. Perestroika gets rewritten every time the play goes up, and is being rewritten right now.
Yep.
Even as we speak, probably, for the production that's about to open on Broadway. Like, Tony, it seems, will never be able to stop himself from fiddling with and tinkering with this play, which is in and of itself about the impossibility of humans to stop changing, which I really love.
Well, there's one way that humans can stop changing, and that's really one of the things that this play is about, which is death and loss. And one thing I was so struck by in reading The World Only Turns Forward. Spins forward. I don't know why
it's literally right up there.
Well, I'm not going to turn around and read it off the screen, Dan.
I'll have Copy fix that later.
One thing that I was really struck by is just how much loss there was, not just in the community that the play came out of, but you lost your best friend and took over her part, and then Tony Kushner's mom died, and I'm just wondering how much you think the pain of that loss and trying to go on afterwards how much of the sort of resonance of the play comes from that? I mean, it's a strange quandary because those are terrible losses, but at the same time, this amazing work has come out of them.
I think it was an era when we were really face to face with death all the time, because so many the theater population was extremely hard hit by the AIDS epidemic, and we lost there was some terrible, terrible losses to encounter. And when you heard that your friends had AIDS, that was a death sentence. It was just a matter of when, not whether they were going to die and how they would go. And so there was a lot, and we were working on it in San Francisco, which was a devastated community. And then there was also the fact that in the Eureka community, Sigrid Werschmidt, who was the original angel and was really a light of a human being, died of breast cancer right at the beginning of the process. And but there were a lot of women in the community who were getting breast cancer. It was a very, very scary time that way. I think there's something environmental about San Francisco that's still true. But I think because the play, particularly Perestroika, is so much about fear of death and fear of illness, the fact that it's as funny as it is, as joyful as it is for the audience as well as for the characters, there's a lot of just wild elation in there. And it's the best jokes are in the second one, in Perestroika. And I think it seemed exceedingly important, for instance, that Pryor not die. That the last line of the play is delivered from Pryor. And, he may not be here for much longer, and he knows that, and that's clear. It's clear that his condition is worse at the end of the play than it was at the beginning of the play, but he, in his mind, is much stronger and much saner. I mean, the epistle, the arrival of the angel and the departure of the angel, the ascent to heaven and back down, is very much a sort of descent into madness. And he's really brought out of it by Belize to some extent. And I think that there's something about the fact that we were looking at death all the time and saturated with death and the fear of it. The fear was constant. And the fact that you don't lose that central character. He does not, as he says, we're not going away. A lot of us are dying, but not all of us. And we're not going away, and we will be citizens. The world only spins forward.
You nailed the title. Great job.
I think we might be ready for questions.
Isaac, do you want to deliver your mic out to people who want to ask
sure.
questions?
I think that there is one out there.
Oh, is there one out there already? There, perfect.
Okay. Do we have any questions out here? Right there in the aisle. I can't. All I can see is an arm with a black sleeve and a dainty hand.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here today. I just saw the play on Broadway recently, and it struck me how funny and exhilarating it is, and how much it matters that there's an audience that's there to react. And it struck me how morose the HBO production is, and that's how a lot of people got to know Angels in America. So maybe it just doesn't work as a movie.
Well,
what do you think?
We must say, Ellen and I watched it together in my apartment and went through a lot of wine, lots and lots of wine.
Can I tell the story?
Yes.
So Kathy had always said that she wasn't going to watch it, and I tried to respect that. I was too curious. But Kathy was in tech for something. You're one woman. It was a one-woman piece. And I thought, well, she's safely gone tonight. And it was happening at 9 or something. And I was living in Kathy's building at the time, and it was a building in which none of us locked the doors on our apartments. Kathy was the only one who got HBO. And so I snuck up into her apartment to watch Angels in America, which she had expressly told me she wasn't going to watch, and that she was like, on principle, was not going to watch it. And I'm watching it and thinking, this is not funny, and it really this is not going well, and maybe I'm wrong, And Kathy walked in, and I was so horrified that I'd been found out. And she said, no. And she went into the kitchen, and you came
Which
out.
wasn't far away.
And you came back with 2 bottles of wine. And she said, that's for you, and this is for me. And we watched it.
And we watched it, the whole thing.
Can you tell the Meryl Streep part? We got to the soup ladies, the homeless lady scene, which is a comic scene.
Funny.
It's reliably funny if you just do the fucking words. And we always had a good time on that scene. It's important that it's funny, that it comes at a juncture that you need a laugh or two. And we were watching it, and Meryl Streep decides, as Hannah Pitt, decides to tear up. And she's feeling sorry for herself, and she starts crying. And we'd been very quiet. And Kathy said, oh, dry up, Meryl. and then it was gloves off, you know.
I mean, as we have Nichols biographer in the house, it's worth noting, I think, that production, that HBO production, was freighted with a lot of expectations for that network and for the sort of the opportunities that cable TV, that prestige cable had at that moment. It was the first prestige cable movie to be packed with movie stars. You know, the first time that cable made this play that is now very commonplace, that people totally understand. Oh, this is what HBO does. They put big fancy movie stars in. Well, in 2003, they never ever did that. And it was also meant to be a kind of message to the rest of America about the AIDS crisis, which was at that point viewed as being, oh, well, it seems like it must be almost over at this point. And so, you know, that movie had a lot of jobs to do, which it seemed to me in watching it essentially made it very difficult to play the comedy in it the way that you might otherwise play it on a stage. And also, the comedy in the play is so dependent on, as you say, having an audience out there with you to say to you, oh, it's okay to laugh at this incredibly hilarious thing. It's happening right in front of us. We're all laughing, right? Great.
It also is dependent upon the rhythm of the language. And Ellen and I probably heard more of the play than anyone else, because we were there all the time, and there were lots of times when we weren't on stage. And it wasn't, the jokes didn't land because the music was wrong. And I don't know if it's a hard thing to do in film or whatever, but I'm very happy to hear that it's funny now, because that's what mattered. You needed to seduce people. The thing that it did and does, I think, is to seduce people by the beauty of its language and the sharpness of its wit. And what it does is to make people think, a lot of people, something for 7 hours that they've never thought before. And that must change your brain, just even a little bit. That's what was one of the great things about being a part of it. There was talked about, what it was like to go. People were walked out of the theater on fire. Talking. You'd go out on the street, and it was loud on the street, people were talking about it. It was just, and then crazy things happened. Like one time, everybody always stood up oh, that's right. The first night we didn't have a standing ovation. And Joe said to George, well, we didn't get a standing ovation. George said, oh, you want a standing ovation? Oh, it's a matter of rhythm. Here, this is what you do. And so we got a standing ovation every night. So anyway, this one night, everybody was standing up, and there were a couple, middle-aged couple, in about the third row, and the wife was beside herself with joy, and her husband was dragging her out of the row by the arm. It was, that got somebody's attention.
But I think more than most plays, it's really about, it's a love poem to plays. It's about the theater as theater. And I feel, the humor is very hard to land in movies, I think, because there is something about the collective, sitting in the dark with a whole bunch of strangers that you need the laughs in order to get the sense of the rhythm. I think that the film actors are at a handicap for that. But it really is about the beauty of the theater and what that connection is. And I think it really succeeds most as a play. But that would be my preference anyway.
All right, any more questions? How about this gentleman over here?
Thank you. When this was still a Slate article, one of my favorite stories in the Slate article was when they had to have the paper put the stage, and it was his old draft. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could tell a little bit about that story and elaborate a little bit on it.
Sure,
because it's so amazing.
It's actually one of my favorite things. Tony Kushner ever said in an interview with us was the way he told this story. So I wish I had the recording of it. I could just be like, but there's a scene in Perestroika that I know Ellen is extremely fond of, and very few other people who've been involved in the show are. No, there's a scene where Pryor goes to heaven, and it's the scene that Kathy was talking about, the stage direction beforehand, the Council of Principalities. So it's these angels, one for each continent, and they're having this conversation, this sort of very complex, austere, odd language. And it's filled with impossible stage directions, and part of what it talks about, because it's actually, if I remember correctly, modeled on kind of like a dysfunctional Bolshevik kind of bureaucrats is who the angels are really, that's why the Bolsheviks appear in the original draft of Perestroika. So there's paper everywhere, right? Because this bureaucracy of heaven is falling apart. And so they got they sourced a paper sorting machine and a fan, and they put them in the roof of the Mark Taper Forum, which is a three-quarter thrust theater. That's important to this story. So the audience is very close by. It's three-quarter thrust theater. And then... this
was in 1992 in Los Angeles, by the way, before the Broadway production.
Before the Broadway production. And they said, well, they hadn't had time to tech it before the performance. And so they were like, well, we need all this paper. Oh, we have all these rewrites of Perestroika sitting around. So let's just put that in the paper sorting machine.
Tony was like, there was like a wheelbarrow in back full of rewrites that I'd thrown away because they were bad.
I'm actually very curious because I never got your point of view on the story. You're standing there and then suddenly like your old lines are raining down on top of you, right?
It made perfect sense.
Yeah, okay. And then so apparently the first preview audience was not super into Perestroika, and according to Tony anyway, and so the scripts are going into the audience. They're kind of like...
Right, they didn't really land on the stage. They, in fact, were blown by the fan into the audience. So the audience, while watching famously the
going like
worst
this.
scene in Perestroika, is having pieces of the script dropped upon them.
And the way Kushner phrased it is he goes, and what they put in the sorting machine are rewrites of the
fucking scenes. And so like that's raining down on the audience. And it's that moment that, Kushner's talked about in a few interviews. He also talks about it in our book where he's like, I've ruined it. It's it. I had my chance and I blew it and this is all over. And he escapes into a stairwell, but it turns out like Spinal Tap not to go anywhere. It's just like an interior stairwell. And so he's trapped in that stairwell as audience members file by being like, the first part was so good, but... So it's like the worst, all because of the... Anyway, so that's the story, which is in the book still. That is the story of the paper sorter. But I imagine for you were just like, some paper. I have this complicated language to deliver.
Well, as soon as you saw it, you thought, well, that would be a good source of paper.
We had a lot of it. Lots of it. You don't want to waste?
Additional questions? It's a little dark out there. Can I? Oh, yes.
I just wanted to talk a bit about the laughter. I saw it last week, and we laughed so hard that we were crying, number one. And I said to the gentleman sitting next to me, and he had seen it in England, and I said, did they laugh as hard in England? He said, no, I was the only one. So I find that quite interesting. And the other thing was because it's 2 nights, you get this real feeling of the audience, you get friendly, and everybody's just like all over each other laughing, and it was just wonderful. So but thank you all.
When Dan and I, so we went to see it in London, and when we went out there to interview the cast for the book and everything like that, and the audience when we saw it was really into it, and and we all became lifelong friends with the people around us, and signed a pact, and but there is that sense of camaraderie. But I would say that the fascinating thing, because this play has a sort of different reputation in London, is they just sort of know it as a canonically great, important, very serious American play.
And they know the movie.
Yeah, so we had the delightful experience of experiencing the audience discover that the play was funny, which they had no one had ever told them it was funny. And that was really wild. And of course, you all had that experience as actors very early on when no one knew what the play was.
Right. I assume that audiences came in all the time being like, well, I guess we're going to go see the 3.5-hour AIDS play.
Well, we also didn't know what was it was always the first audience, the first big, because we didn't know what was funny. And the hairdresser joke stopped the show. And we didn't know that it was going to do that.
Particularly Fleet Week.
But
it was. I've never, that term that it stopped the show. I've never actually experienced that, and I will never experience it again. But when, we can do the exchange. But when Pryor said,
please do it.
No, it wasn't.
Well, it was Pryor.
Hannah says to Pryor, "Are you a hairdresser?"
What? No. Well, first we have to establish the fact that she says, "Well, you must be homosexual," and he says, "Well, what? Because I look like a homosexual? You just make that assumption, and you think I'm like a hairdresser or something?"
Are you?
Well, it would be your lucky day if I was, because. And it was people just couldn't stop laughing, and finally, and there would be that thing where it would hit it would start to ebb, and then they'd laugh about the fact that they were still laughing, and then they go, and Stephen just walked to the lip of the stage, and he said, "You have to stop. It's a really long play." And it went on, like,
He was so funny. The physical comedy that he did. I remember so clearly the scene when he's in the doctor's office and the pillar shoots up, and he just retracts all of his limbs into this little hospital gown like a hermit crab, like really suddenly, and it was so funny.
The for many of us, there's a way in which the San Francisco production was our favorite because it was poor theater. The theater didn't have lots of money, and there weren't lots of effects, and
It was like a shower curtain.
Shower curtain.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful and very beautiful. And so it was nice to be reminded of the play as we were in that version of it.
reporting this book and hearing from actors who've been in productions of this show all over the country and all over the world, many of them for very small theaters with budgets probably less than that Eureka Theater production. It's like truly marvelous to see the way that all these different productions have found to solve these problems, like little tricks that one theater company has found sort of make their way through the canon over the years. So like now it's like a thing. If you're a theater company without a lot of money, you put your angel up on a ladder, just like they did in the NYU Perestroika workshop, and then David Cromer did it in Chicago, and now that's a thing you do. But the ways that people have solved these problems in big theaters and little theaters, I found like very inspiring. And all these stories from actors, you know, in a tiny theater in Silver Spring, Maryland, or someone in Greenville, South Carolina, talking about how doing the angel felt so weird there, and the audience just didn't know what to do about all the orgasms in that scene. It was just like great to hear all these stories of people who've like taken this play out into the world.
And the people were talking about the set. You might have imagined that people, you know, spent all the money they could in the world for the Broadway production, but that wasn't actually true. Wasn't actually true. They got a deal on the computer, and it was an early computer-driven set, and it came from automobile manufacturing. And so what it was really good at was to do small, repeated tasks. What it wasn't so good at was to do what it was called upon to do on the stage, which were large, complex tasks that happened at odd moments. And so we were very lucky because Mary Klinger, who had come with us from San Francisco, was meant to be the assistant stage manager because it was Broadway and her name was Mary. But it turned out that
Happy International Women's Day.
We get a day.
The person who was the stage manager, the production stage manager, was very good with computers. So he spent his entire time in the basement tricking the computer. And mostly it worked, but not always. And Mary was running the show from the Mary Klinger Memorial.
That said, the flying was done by two human beings.
Yeah.
You know, it was
Not a computer.
me and Doug and Bernie. And Doug did the up and down, and Bernie did the back and forth. And that is why I didn't die. You know, that's why all those poor kids in Kiss of the Spider Women. No. Spider-Man, whatever. There's spiders involved. Those kids who, you know, that's because it was run by a computer. But because Doug could feel that something was wrong on the line, he wouldn't yank me up into the, you know. That said, there were some appalling things that happened, but, and after one of them, when I'd been going back and forth between pillars and upside down and kept hitting the pillars before they finally got me up. And I got all the way down and I said, "Do you think anyone noticed?" And Doug said, "Ellen, I heard them weeping."
Okay, I think we've just about run out of time, but thank you, Isaac.
Give it up for Ellen and Kathy.